Welcome to the Ducks Unlimited podcast, the only podcast about all things waterfowl. From hunting insights to science-based discussions about ducks, geese, and issues affecting waterfowl and wetlands conservation in North America, we bring the resource to you. The DU Podcast with your host, Chris Jennings.
Joining us today is Dr. Fritz Reed, the Director of Boreal and Arctic Conservation. Dr. Reed, welcome back to the podcast.
Good to see you, Chris.
Hey, we brought you on today, and of course, we're going to touch on the Boreal. We want to talk about the Arctic. We want to talk about the species and the different conservation efforts that are going on up there. But first, I want to start out, and I like to review this every time we talk about the Boreal, and even the Arctic, really, to an extent that kind of provide our audience an idea of how large, what a vast expanse of landscape the Boreal is, and which is one of the reasons why it is so difficult to get these conservation efforts together up there, because it is such a large area. But kind of explain what this habitat is and how and where it is, really.
Sure. So the Boreal forest is the single largest biome that exists on the Earth. About 2/3 of it are Russia and Scandinavia, and about 1/3 of it is found in North America. And in North America, it goes from western Alaska all the way across the continent, through the territories, through the northern provinces that we normally think of as prairie provinces, right all the way to Labrador. And 1.5 billion acres, a huge landscape. And within that landscape, there's thousands of streams, of rivers, tens of millions of wetlands, lakes. It's a very wet environment. Somewhere between 10 to 25% of the entire Boreal is wet. And so as you look at that system, it makes sense that it's an area that ducks, geese, and other water birds would really use.
Absolutely. And just to kind of, even for myself, and kind of paint the picture for, let's say, a duck hunter that goes to North Dakota, they're looking at, the North American prairies, and then you have like the Canadian prairies. So imagine we're just going straight up. The Canadian prairies, then you go into the parklands, then transitions into the Boreal, and then the Arctic.
That's right.
Okay. I just wanted to paint that picture for our audience of someone who's like trying to visualize what that is. All summer long, we talked and even had you on the show, kind of talking about habitat conditions, but we talked about the dry prairie conditions. When the prairies are dry, where does the Boreal come into play?
So it really is important in two different ways. It's important, one, for birds that are returning to the Boreal and are going to breed in the Boreal. And those are typically hens that hatched out and as ducklings grew up in the Boreal, they'll tend to return where they originally hatched out. They meet their mate on the wintering grounds and then come north. And the second real important value is for birds that are going to have flyover roles coming out. Normally would have gone to the prairies. They find the prairies totally dry, and they move farther north. Now, it's my understanding, talking to Scott Stevens, that there's some areas in Alberta, in South Dakota, where we still have viable wetlands, and ducks are going to nest. And it's not like they're not producing any ducks, but the vast majority of birds are going to overfly the prairies this year. Yeah, and we talk about, it's even been referenced, the Boreal has been discussed as like the second duck factory. And one thing that I would like for you to stress as well is that these birds are not just going to the Boreal when it is dry. I mean, the Boreal produces a large number of birds every year, whether it's dry in the prairies or not. Kind of explain that and really the production side of the Boreal, just even when the prairies are wet. Sure. So if you look continentally, we know there's kind of three big duck factories, and that is the U.S. prairies is about 1/3 of duck production, 1/3 in the Canadian prairies, and about 1/3 in the Boreal, especially the Western Boreal. Now, Actually, they probably add up to about 85% of our breeders. And then the Great Lakes area, California mallards. There are other areas that are important, but those three are clearly the most important. And we do know that when the prairies are wet, the densities of breeding is incredible. You can see 60 nests per square mile. But in the Boreal, birds are really spaced out. It's really low density breeding up there.
And that's probably just a matter of it's such a large geographical area, I would imagine. I mean, there's just so much, so much available habitat,
right.
I would say.
And they space themselves out.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah, absolutely right.
And you touched on this just now briefly, but you mentioned the Western Boreal Forest. And as an organization, we talk about this all the time, especially internal, and we throw it around the Western Boreal Forest, but kind of define what that is.
Sure. It's probably easily defined as Western Alaska to Eastern Manitoba. So as you're moving west, incredible wetland systems, the Saskatchewan Delta, the northern areas of Manitoba, and if you've been to Winnipeg, you've seen the prairie part of Manitoba, but the reality is Manitoba is about 80% boreal. And then the very important Saskatchewan wetlands of the boreal, Alberta, British Columbia, and then the territories, the Yukon, the Northwest Territories, Nunavut, all very, very important in the Western Boreal. And as you go north along the Mackenzie River system, the trees in the Mackenzie Delta almost reach the Arctic Ocean. I mean, a lot of people think that there's a huge tundra area that you reach before you get to the Arctic Ocean, but in reality, at least along the Mackenzie system, it goes almost right to the ocean.
So that would be like one of those areas where you'd run into, as far as, the ungulates go, you've got caribou, moose, probably 2 or 3 different species of bear, potentially even polar bears getting that far.
Polar bears,
yeah,
muskox. Yeah, absolutely. The diversity of wildlife you see, and it's incredibly important for neotropical songbirds. Mm-hmm. I mean, the number of birds that come out of the boreal every year, it's like 2.5 to 5 million birds come out of the boreal in each fall, and just tremendous diversity. And they may go as far south as Latin America. Some of those neotrops, incredible migrations.
Yeah, and that was another thing I was going to ask you about it. That you do a lot of work with Audubon as well, and kind of going back and forth, and just kind of I wanted you to touch on the fact that while we're so waterfowl centric, sometimes we forget that even some of the conservation efforts that we're doing in these areas are focusing on so many different species. And I didn't know if you had an example of one of those species. That's what I was going to ask you about. A songbird that make these just magnificent migrations that even you wouldn't even, us as humans, we don't even imagine the distance that these birds cover year in and year out. So if you have an example of that, I think it'd be awesome.
Sure. That's very true. And we do work very closely with Dr. Jeff Wells, mm-hmm. who's with National Audubon. And among some of the cases, one of the things is we're only just now learning where some of those great wintering areas are, because they've only been able to have the technology to be able to track those birds within the last 5-6 years. So a good example is the Canada warbler. The Canada warbler, which breeds across the southern boreal all the way from Quebec into Manitoba, Saskatchewan, they will migrate down, and they have 2 very distinct wintering grounds. One is in Ecuador, one is in Colombia.
Wow.
And the fact that they've isolated that and found those areas, and then that relationship between the Canadian boreal and the southern wintering grounds in Latin America really is phenomenal. And you go down there, and those people talk about, thank you for taking care of our birds,
Yeah.
in your summer.
That's right.
So.
No, that's cool. And that's something that sometimes I feel like we don't talk about enough, some of those relationships that we have, And let's get back to ducks real quick, because I do have a couple kind of species-specific questions for you. We always talk about the boreal birds as widgeon and green-winged teal, some of the cavity nesters, ringnecks, but kind of explain to our audience how much diversity in waterfowl species is up there, including geese.
Sure. And just from ducks alone, there's 15 species where 50% or more of their continental population breeds in the boreal forest. So those species you mentioned, both lesser and greater scaup, a number of the mergansers, the scoters, and then for the geese, both small Canada geese and white-fronted geese utilize those boreal forest habitats. And what's interesting is if you look at the colonies that exist up there, they're typically in relatively small colonies. You know, when you think of white geese, you think of these massive, huge colonies of hundreds, thousands of nests. Whereas with white fronts and small Canadas, typically they're in small groups of 40, 60, 100 birds, and that's where they operate. And they often operate along riverine or stream systems where there's low marshy areas, and they can be very, very successful.
Yeah, and it was really eye-opening. You and I were up there. It was 7 years ago when I went to at least. I think it was that long ago.
Don't say that.
Yeah, I know.
Don't say that.
When I came back, everyone was like, "Oh, what was the hunting like?" And we really only hunted one lake,
right?
Which I think our guide there, James Marlowe,
right,
had mentioned that we were like the first white people to ever hunt around that lake or on that lake, which I thought was pretty cool.
Yeah.
And everyone's like, "Oh, how many weird different species of ducks did you shoot?" And I was like, "Yeah, we shot mallards."
And green-winged teal.
Yeah. I was like, we did kill a couple scoters though. I think that was really cool.
We saw a long-tailed too, but we didn't get it.
Yeah. And we really had great shoots, but we were shooting mallards. And they're like, mallards? Why were there mallards up there? I was like, they're
the
up
common
there.
bird.
Yeah. I was like, they're all over the place up there.
Yeah.
But I think
and I saw James Marlowe about 2 years ago.
Oh, you did?
And chatted with him, and he's still hunting up there. His nephew is the chief of the Acacio up there.
Okay, yeah, and just kind of give people a reference. We did we did a trip, and it was with Outdoor Life, and they had a big feature, and that was when I was on the media relations side, and we went up there, and we actually stayed in the chief's house.
Yeah. Yeah,
and he
Well, it was actually one of the negotiators for the Acacio people. Yeah.
That's right. Yeah, and so we stayed there, and then we hunted and fished, and we went out to James's cabin along that lake, and it was a fantastic experience. Totally eye opening me, because I had a complete misunderstanding of what the boreal was until you get up to Yellowknife, and then you get in that small plane, and you're flying over Great Slave, and you're like, oh my gosh, like this. I mean, you could look down and just see the creeks and rivers and just water everywhere. I was like, oh man, this is unbelievable. So it was really eye-opening, which is the same thing that we say about the prairies. We're trying to get people to go to the prairies to open their eyes to what that is, but it's the same thing with the boreal. It's such a cool habitat and a cool area to go to. What are some of the conservation issues that the boreal faces? Like, we know, pretty dead set on some of the issues here in North America and even in Canada, in the lower portions of Canada. But in the boreal, it's such a different landscape. What are some of the conservation issues that we face in habitat degradation and loss?
You look at the prairies and some of our core wintering grounds, and we know that we've had such an impact by man over the last 150 years that we spend millions, billions of dollars for restoration. The thing about the boreal is it's really low impact right now. When we first got involved 20 years ago, it was estimated somewhere 3 to 4% of the boreal had been impacted by industries to date. And what we found is that there's some leading industries that want to maintain a viable system up there and still have the ability to do some extraction. So our program is based upon both protection, fully protected areas, and sustainable development. And we've really been very, very fortunate over the course of 20 years to recognize that Indigenous-led conservation in the Boreal is a very, very positive thing, and that a number of these First Nations have tremendous pride, tremendous faith in these great habitats, and love not only the game that's there, but the water, the land itself, and really want to honor it and have it long time, so that they can hunt, fish, and trap in perpetuity, just like we do. And you go up there, and a lot of those people love Ducks Unlimited people because they say, yeah, you people are like us. We love to canoe. We love to camp. We love to fish. We love to hunt. It's like what you guys like to do.
Yeah. No, I knew it would, that was a good, and I think we were in that process when we went up there, and that's kind of what we were doing that piece for Outdoor Life. And we got up there and we got out to the cabin, and like right next to James's cabin, like his brother had a cabin, or it might have been his cousin, and they were out there skinning a moose when we walked up. And I'm from Indiana. I live in Memphis, Tennessee. I've not seen a moose, and they got one strung up, and I was like, oh man, this is just so cool. But that's right. It's definitely a connection of, outdoors mentality. You could tell how much they cared about the habitat and just being a part of it, which I thought was really eye-opening for me. Kind of describe how some of these conservation efforts work, in a sense that the guardianship, the way that the indigenous people have, really stepped up as guardians of these areas, and kind of describe some of these areas.
They have their native rights in terms of the land and what happens in the land, and ultimately those decisions will be made by them. And there is a role for Ducks Unlimited to help them in facilitating reaching a land use plan. We can help provide by taking Landsat imagery and mapping those regions, showing them where the wetlands are, where the various habitats are. We can overlay known data on where important duck areas are, where important moose areas are, and they can then use that as they develop a plan for how land use is going to occur, where they identify these are going to be sustainable development areas that may have timber extraction, may have mineral extraction, may have oil gas, and these are areas that they're going to protect, and they're big blocks of fully protected areas where they can still hunt, fish, trap, etc., but they're not looking at extraction in a major way.
And when you say big blocks, you're talking million acres at a time,
at least, yeah. At least, yeah. We've been very, very fortunate working with the governments of the provinces and of the territories, working with the governments of the indigenous people, and working with leading industrial groups that, we're setting aside certain areas, like you say, at least 1 million acres, big blocks. And then there are other areas that we clearly identify. These are areas of sustainable development and ones that, industry is going to play a major role. I mean, those people are looking for livelihoods. Mm-hmm. And one of the livelihoods can be Indigenous Guardians. This is a program, it really is modeled off of work that was done in Australia, where they had Aboriginal people of Australia that were on the land and looked after the land. And then the Haida Gwaii people in coastal BC, they had watchmen that would watch over the historic buildings that used to be where their elders had lived and had been. And the Guardian program really takes off from there, so that individual communities, individual First Nations can identify young youth that are great at running a motor, are great at living in the outdoors, are great at tracking, and they can help describe and help people see these various areas. I mean, it's wonderful. A really strong Guardians program would be great in terms of tourists coming up and helping guide us out there and showing us the land and canoeing and camping and hunting and fishing. And we think there's some real opportunities.
Yeah, and once you set that infrastructure in place, and sometimes saying guardianships and watch, what was it, watchmen?
Watchmen, yeah.
That can be a little confusing for some people, but what this is, like you said, it's based on kind of tourism, but it's also, these are search and rescue teams.
Absolutely.
These are guides These are caribou guides. These are
forest firefighters.
Exactly. This is the infrastructure of almost a national park.
Exactly. Only it's the people that live in the land that know the land.
That actually know where they're going. Not that national park people don't. I'm just saying they know it better than anyone, which is really cool program. And I think that's something that we don't talk about enough as far as Ducks Unlimited, that when we provide this technical assistance in some way in these big, land deals, technically is what it is, and kind of guide some of this conservation effort. We don't talk about that enough as far as, this is waterfowl habitat, but we're also conserving caribou migration corridors. The fishing up there, the hydrology of the place is phenomenal. I mean, when we went up there, we fished, and it was awesome. And so it's like one thing that sticks out to me, that DU's conservation efforts are doing so much more than just ducks, that, it really needs to be touted, and for people to understand, like, man, this is a massive undertaking.
Right.
And,
20% of the world's carbon is in the soils and the vegetation of the boreal forest. 25% of the world's fresh water is in the boreal forest of North America. And the values are extraordinary.
Yeah, and I recommend anyone who's never been to Yellowknife, for example, that area, just flying into that area is so unbelievably beautiful and awesome tourist destination, but also for fishing. You can go up there. There's tons of tourism opportunities up there to get to the Boreal. And that's something that I think our audience would really find interesting, to be able to, just Google it and look at the Boreal forest, look at some of these landscapes. You touched on this a little bit, but I wanted to go back because I think it's a really cool part of what DU does and what waterfowl managers all over the country, all over the continent are doing. You mentioned the technology to be able to track the Canada warbler. How has that technology helped in the Boreal and the Arctic, as far as, your telemetry studies, the GPS tracking of birds? Like, how has that kind of opened up in your time as a, Ducks Unlimited scientist? How have you seen that transition, and what are the new benefits of this technology?
Well, certainly we're seeing a connection in terms of transitory movements. Because of banding, which of course has been around for quite a while, we understood where a bird nested, and we understood where a bird was collected or taken on the wintering grounds. But to actually see the patterns of movements is really been illuminating. And, at a local level, you can look at movements and habitat selection on the breeding ground. So for like geese, you can look at where birds move as they graze to have growth of their chicks. And then once the chicks are able to fly, where are the first movements that occur? And, do you see a straight, one-time movement, or is it a series of leapfrogs that are smaller movements? So you can learn a lot by looking at that kind of telemetry data. A good example are Pacific black brant, which they're staging in the fall in Cold Bay area and in Alaska, and they take almost a single flight down to Baja California in Mexico. Mm-hmm. It's like 3,000 miles.
Yeah.
And the data shows they are not stopping. They're making a direct flight. And we've learned through energetics that they're able to pick up 700 grams of body fat, at Eisenbeck Lagoon, and they burn up almost exactly 700 grams of body fat to make it on that flight. So those kinds of things happen. At the same time, most of it is they're making more leapfrog movements where they're able to fly a couple hundred miles, stop, they'll replenish, they'll spend a week and a half, get the resources back so they can make another flight. And it's amazing. So that's one of the things that the telemetry data has revealed.
Yeah, 40 years ago, there's none of that was even possible. Well, there were some different things that you could do, but the advancements in technology that are benefiting waterfowl research are fantastic. We've had entire shows based on that, and
you bet.
It's pretty fascinating, and our listeners always get a good they always respond to the telemetry studies and the GPS and the banding and anything that's tracking, marking, being able to show how these birds did this and did that. We always get a little response on that. So it's always cool to discuss. Speaking of birds that make long flights and burn some energy, and me personally, I always have an interest in the Arctic geese. And surprisingly enough, we've had some great feedback from listeners on those shows. We had Ray Alasauskas on in the first season, and we had some great responses from that. People loved hearing about the light goose colonies and the work that he was doing up there. Can you provide us an idea, just give us an idea of what that Arctic habitat looks like right now, and what the colonies, the breeding colonies up there. Is there any idea? I'm not even sure if there was a bunch of people up there this year or at all. But you can just give us some insight on what's going on in the Arctic.
Right, and that unfortunately is one of the results of the pandemic. Most scientists were unavailable to go north, and the reason being that they did not want to expose any of the indigenous communities to the pandemic. Many of those communities had been hurt in previous pandemics, and so really recognizing right away that you don't want to expose people to that. So unfortunately, research was limited. You could do some Landsat work in terms of description of habitat types, and I think some of that has gone on. I am hearing we are learning that the increases that have occurred in mid-latitude in some of the snow goose populations are also occurring now at a pretty rapid rate in some of the western populations. So Banks Island, both for snow geese, for Ross's geese, even Wrangel Island in Russia, which produces snow geese and Ross's geese that come down the Pacific coast, those populations have been increasing. What's interesting is not all Arctic geese have their populations have blown up. A good example are Pacific black brant. We actually worry about they've been basically flat in a population, but there's been some decline in certain areas, and there's some concern along those lines. One of the theories that I've heard is that with the expansion of white geese populations in the north, that Arctic fox and Jaegers have fared fairly well. But snow geese and Ross's geese tend to nest a kilometer or a couple kilometers from the coastline, whereas brant and dowitchers, for example, nest right on the coastline. Well, Jaegers and foxes follow the coastline.
Yeah.
So they're the first to get whacked. And if you've got a population increasing that's maintaining and keeping predators at a higher level, that's going to have, unfortunately, an impact on other populations.
Yeah, no, that's fascinating to think about. And the one thing that maybe our audience doesn't really understand is, we've talked about this. There are pintails that breed in the Arctic.
Yes, absolutely.
And people
Absolutely.
kind of dismiss that. They're like, we think pintails are very prairie centric at times, but really, there's so many different species that are breeding up there as well. Kind of explain that mix of diversity.
Sure. One of the things you'll see as you go on the Arctic plain is big numbers of sea ducks, the eiders, the long-tailed ducks, and then fairly, good densities of pintails. You'll see scaup up there. We did a lot of mapping on the North Slope in Alaska and would regularly see waterfowl in a big way. And of course, the Arctic geese are there across much of the habitat.
Yeah. No, that paints a pretty good picture, everyone. The you mentioned there may be some news, just recently announced of some conservation efforts in the Arctic. You want to get into the details of that?
Sure. Well, first of all, in the last several years, the Canadian government announced the single largest protected marine area in the Arctic, and that's an area in Lancaster Sound, which is in the eastern portion of Canada, and it's extremely important for marine mammals and for sea ducks in that area. And the Inuit people that are in this area were really pleased to see this effort because they can still hunt and fish, but it protects it from any extraction industry that might have some interest in that area. They're also concerned with ice melting at a more regular basis. There's a lot more shipping in this area, and so shipping concerns are, do you start having corridors where ships should go? Because a lot of that has not been fully mapped, and you get a rogue rock and take the hull out of a ship, and that can be pretty catastrophic. Yeah. But there's a new one that's coming up. The Mushkegowuk people, who are Cree people in the coast of Hudson Bay and James Bay, and those waterfowlers, in Ohio, in Michigan, will know of those areas, in New York, and those people are protecting the coastal areas and the marine inland areas in a really broad area. And that will be a wonderful area for ducks, geese, shorebirds, really phenomenal.
Yeah, and these areas are being protected like in perpetuity. It's kind of
absolutely.
Okay, yeah,
absolutely.
And what kind of agreement is that? Is that with the Indigenous people and the Canadian government, or how does that work?
Right. So it's really a tri-agreement. So it'll be the First Nations, it'll be the province of Ontario, the province of Quebec, and then the federal government. So each plays an important role in helping sign that agreement.
Cool. Fritz, this has been great. I think having you on regularly would be a good idea, just to provide additional updates on some of these conservation efforts, but also provide, I think it'd be good to have you on and to talk about how this habitat transitions throughout the fall. We're talking about it now, early fall, but at what point, and I do this since I've been up there, which is interesting because I check, the weather
Absolutely.
in Yellowknife. Because when it gets cold and it stays cold up there. Right. And so, I know that those boreal birds are going to hop. They're, most typically their first step's going to be somewhere in the Canadian prairie. So if I was planning on going to Canada, I'm watching that weather up in the Boreal, anywhere that I can get a decent weather gauge to, and keeping my eye on that in the early stages of fall, because that's where it really begins. The fall flight starts up there when things start freezing. So we'll definitely have to have you on, kind of paint a picture of that, and just talk about the Boreal in general. Maybe we'll get some emails from our audience. You can email the podcast at dupodcast@ducks.org. And if we get any questions from our audience, I can forward them over to Fritz, and we can have Fritz answer them. I think that's a good way to kind of maybe open up a little bit of communication with the podcast and our audience. But Fritz, thanks for joining us today. This has been fantastic.
Well, thank you, Chris. I really enjoyed it.
I'd like to thank our guest, Dr. Fritz Reed, for coming on and talking about the Boreal and the Arctic, and even some of the new conservation efforts that Ducks Unlimited's involved in up there. I'd like to thank our producer, Clay Baird, for doing a great job in getting the podcast out to you, and I'd like to thank you, the listener, for joining us and supporting wetlands conservation.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the DU Podcast. Be sure to rate, review, and subscribe to the show, and visit www.ducks.org/DU Podcast for resources based on today's topics, as well as access to more episodes. Opinions expressed by guests do not necessarily reflect those of Ducks Unlimited. Until next time, stay tuned to the Ducks.